us today. We have Mayowa Abiru is going to be speaking to us. And then we also have Mike Imafo. Please, I apologize if I am butchering your name. Forgive me. All right, so we have those amazing facilitators with us today, and I'm sure they are ready to share their wealth of knowledge um, with us. So we before we go on, right? If you were here yesterday, I'd like you to just unmute and say something that stood out for you, right? Especially for those who are not here, so that they can know that they missed yesterday. So if you were here yesterday, you were here for the breakout sessions, you were here for the facilitator session, for the Q&A session. Please just unmute yourself, or you can type in the chat box. I will read it out, and let's get the conversation going before we get into the sessions for today. Right, I will give us a few minutes. Anybody?
Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Hi, Toluwani here. So I was very, very brilliant. I particularly like the fact that we had case studies that we reviewed and everyone gave their opinion on it, especially when we were talking about, okay, what are the features of good infrastructure, and whether maybe if a government has maybe built an infrastructure and there are certain things still lacking, can we say it's good enough? What are the other things that can be done? And I particularly liked the breakout session as well, because we spoke about the different SDG goals. So in my breakout session, we talked about clean and affordable energy, and we just reviewed, what can be done, what are the infrastructure that we need to have in place to ensure that we have clean and affordable energy. So it was really, really good. I particularly liked the interactive sessions, so I'm looking forward to today's session.
Thank you so much, Toluwani. Daniel.
Yes, thank you very much. I think one session I really liked was, I liked everything, but one interesting aspect I learned yesterday was from Sandra's session when she talked about infrastructure from the lens of like the World Bank. And it was really fascinating to understand the due diligence that is involved from that perspective in terms of financing and providing funds for infrastructure initiatives like this. And it was very interesting to see how much detail they get into when they are trying to identify suitable projects for a country. And that was one of the things I learned and I found very fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Sahid. Sahid, you have the floor.
On the issue of Sandra, where she discussed and elaborate most of the questions raised by the colleagues concerning the mistakes where other industry or organization make in applying for infrastructural development. And she elaborate more which mistake that they made and what are the qualities for you to apply for such kind of things.
Right. Saeed, we can't hear you anymore. I guess it's network. All right, does any okay. Okay, thank you so much, Saeed. Thank you so much. One last person before we go on. One last person. Just one more person before we carry on.
Hello, good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
This is Jenny from Borno State. Yesterday's session was actually interactive. I actually learned a lot yesterday. Considering the fact that it has to do with almost I mean, infrastructure carries almost all the whole of the goals that involves SDG. So I actually learned a lot, especially when Sandra spoke. I mean, who would have ever known that the World Bank has a role also to play in infrastructure, considering the fact that the government we are having today has so many ups and downs. But then she made so much clarity on it yesterday, and I learned a lot because personally, I would think maybe people just raise funds for so many organizations, and then at the end of the day, there are no backups, there are no evidence to prove that these funds are actually being utilized for what they are supposed to be utilized for. But then she made that clarity saying that, okay, they have to bring back report feedbacks and all.
Yeah.
So, and then the interactive session during our breakout room, I learned a lot from Toluani and Daniel. I mean, it was actually a nice day yesterday. So I'm looking forward to having a great day today in the
Amazing.
breakout room, the general session as a whole. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you everyone for sharing. Right about now, we're just going to go into the first general session, and it will be taken by Mike Imafo. Mike Imafo is an infrastructure, finance, and public policy expert, and is going to be speaking to us on building Nigeria's infrastructure future. Please make welcome Mike Imafo. Mike, you have the floor.
Good. Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm really excited to be here. The infrastructure space is one sector that really excites. Also a research economist, but anytime it comes to discussing issues around infrastructure, I'm always very excited to share. And so thank you, Infra Spotlight, for inviting me to be part of this very interesting conversation. But can you confirm you can see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right. So, I have 35 minutes to speak, but I think I will just because I want this to also be very interactive. So I'll keep my slide to about 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes, and then allow enough time, about 15 to 20 minutes for interaction, because I realize that most times it's when we have these interactions that we can read down to some of the nuances that might be missing from our conversation. So what I'm just going to do with my deck is to set the context, and then we can take it up from there in terms of sort of questions and interaction contributions that we want to make. And so when I look at building Nigeria's infrastructure future, I think what comes to my mind is what does the future look like? And by future, in my mind, I'll be looking at, okay, within the next 10, 15, 20 years, what's really going to be the topical issue in the world? What is really going to drive the world? And one of those things that come to my mind is technology. The progress we've made in technology over the last few years, over the last decade, in fact, we've not made that progress, in the century before. And the way technology is rapidly evolving, it means that we need to strengthen our infrastructure base to be able to tap into that opportunity. Otherwise, we will miss out of the next revolution that is coming. Which at this point in our nation's history, we shouldn't be talking about power supply. We shouldn't be talking about internet connectivity. These are minimum. We should be talking about, more advanced sort of infrastructure that would drive the sort of development agenda that we're looking at. I know yesterday there were a lot of there must have been a lot of discussion around where we are in terms of infrastructure. Apologies, I couldn't join the session yesterday. I was in another retreat. But I just wanted to set out some context again for us to really see where we are. And because to discuss the future, we need to have a very clear appreciation of where we are today, and have a clear understanding of what is required to move us from where we are today to where we need to be. In terms of from an economic standpoint, when you're trying to see how well your infrastructure has developed, one of the things you want to be looking at is the percentage of your infrastructure stock as relating to your GDP. Global benchmark is about 70%. Our infrastructure stock is between 25 to 30%. So you realize that we have significant work to do. If you look at comparator countries, and I've attempted to focus just on in Africa, on other African countries, because typically we like to use foreign other countries from other jurisdictions, like in the Americas and Europe. But I've tried to also let's even compare ourselves. How are we faring? How are we performing within the African context? You realize that South Africa is way over even the global benchmark is at 87%, Egypt 60%, Kenya is at 50%. But yes, Nigeria was still struggling between 25 and 30%. And we've been at this point for a very long time. And that is why it's very worrying. We look at our transport sector, less than 50% of Nigerians have reliable access to electricity. Digital infrastructure penetration, particularly in the rural areas, remain very low. And now here is the worrying part. We need about, based on the Nigerian Integrated Infrastructure Master Plan, we need about 30 trillion, based on the 3 trillion, dollars, based on the estimates, to bridge this infrastructure gap over 30 years. And that's since 2015. And we've not really made progress when the NIMP was done. Our current budget, the current estimated budget for 2025, if you put it to dollar terms, is about 29 billion. But to bridge our gap, our infrastructure gap, we need about 100 billion annually to invest in infrastructure. So what this means is that even if we take our whole budget and say, you know what, we're not going to pay salaries, we're not going to do anything, let's dump it into infrastructure, it's still not going to be sufficient to bridge the infrastructure gap we're suffering. So the question is, how is the future looking like? What do we really need to do to bridge this infrastructure gap and achieve the vision we have for the future for Nigeria? You look at critical sectors like transport sector, over 40% of federal roads are in poor condition. Let's not even go to subnationals at state level, federal roads alone. The rail network, very poor. Energy, we have 4,000 megawatts of electricity for over 200 million people. Whereas a country like Egypt added over 13,000 megawatts within 4 years. And we're struggling with 4,000 megawatts for over 34 decades. So there are issues. Removal of the fuel subsidy, increased fuel prices, making business operating costs to skyrocket. Only about 30% of Nigerians have access to. You see, how many we drill in our houses? Maybe just 1 or 2 persons here, or if we might even find anybody, right? But again, go to the rural communities and see it's even worse, because here we even in some of these towns and urban areas, we even have access to boreholes. But in rural communities, it's stream, they drink water from stream. And this has implications for health and other aspects of well-being. So in terms of what we're losing, over 2% of our GDP annually due to poor infrastructure. And I think this is even underestimated. I think we're losing more than this. Because if you look at the impact on exports, you can't easily take your goods to the ports competitively. You can't compete even within Africa, we can't compete because of the cost of doing business. And one of the major drivers of the cost of doing business is infrastructure. So a whole lot. Worsening this is even our population growth. We have a very high population growth, growing faster than our GDP. It means that the rate at which we can cater for our population is reducing. So our population is growing faster than the productive capacity of the economy to even cater for that population. Our public debt is ballooning. If you look at our public debt profile, you look at the estimates, you realize that we're over 50% of our GDP on debt. If you look at it from a debt service, in 2022, 100% of the revenues we were generating from the economy was servicing debt, 100%. It started dropping in 2023, right? So how do we get to the future with this kind of a bleak atmosphere? And this is where we need to really think carefully. And this is where I want a lot of our conversation today to bother, because we understand what the issues are, to be honest. I'm not sure there's anyone here who doesn't understand what the infrastructure issues are. If you do not understand, at least you feel it. You know how much you pay for if you're using public transport, if you're failing your car. In fact, the roads are damaging our cars. So we have a clear appreciation of what the issues are. But how do we move from issues to solution? And I will, and this is part of where I will start rounding up, and and then I'll drill down to the potentials for public-private partnerships. So what do we need to do going forward? First is that we need to increase our spending on infrastructure. It's very low, but there are two issues when it comes to increasing spending on infrastructure. One issue is the fact that the amount of money we spend on infrastructure is low, which is where there is a lot of focus on. But the other issue that is also very important is the fact that the efficiency of the current expenditure on infrastructure is low. So what I mean by that, for instance, is that if you see a project, an infrastructure project, that 100 billion is being deployed on, if you look carefully at the end of the day, what really goes into that project is far lower than that, because of corruption, because of institutional weakness, because of lack of value engineering. There are a whole lot of inefficiencies that we lose. Because you look at a road constructed by the government, and then look at that same road being constructed by a private sector individual, and then you realize, or a private company, you realize that the difference is so much. Even look at comparatively across Africa and across the world. What is the cost of a kilometer of road? Maybe it's a take home. Look at the cost of constructing a kilometer of road in Nigeria and for comparator countries, or even a railway track. So there is a significant loss of efficiency. But apart from that, there is also the fact that we are not investing enough in infrastructure, and we need to do more. Look at the proportion of capital expenditure to recurrent expenditure. It's always a struggle. Sometimes even the capital expenditure are not even really geared towards social sectors. A lot of them sometimes go into other sectors like the defense sector, the security sector, and really very little spillover effect comes down to social sectors around health, education, and the likes. So it's a key issue. We need to improve on that. Now, but how do we get the monies we need to spend? Because of the size of our economy, we're not pulling our weight as an economy enough. Our GDP is not what it should be. We should be doing far more than what our GDP is. But that is also not that's not the only issue. We're not also tapping as much as we can from our GDP. Our tax to GDP ratio is currently at about 9.3%. This is because of a lot of the reforms that happened within the last 2 years. But prior to this time, it was about 6%. Even at the 9.3%, we're about one of the lowest in the world when it comes to the amount of tax we can get from our GDP. Why is that so? Because we have an inefficient system, one. We also have a significant number of Nigerians that are in the informal sector. About 53% of the GDP is being contributed by the informal sector. So how do you tax the informal sector when you've not formalized them? So there are missed opportunities, even within the current structure and system that we have. There are significant missed opportunities. We need to recalibrate. And I think there's a lot of work ongoing in government right now. We hope that, at the end of the day, it yields, the sort of results we're expecting. But our GDP needs to rise, and that means that we need to enhance the productive capacity of our economy. We need to invest in our people. We need to be able to also take as much value as we can from that GDP, because a lot of the value is lost. I've attempted to dimension what needs to be done into 4 key aspects, and this is part of this is one of the. I'll start rounding up by that, because I also want us to interact a lot. One is there's a political aspect of recalibrating our approach to infrastructure development and delivery, that we position Nigeria to be one of the best economies, or a very fast-growing economy, for the kind of future we are looking at. If we must play competitively in the future that is coming in the next 5-10 years and above, we must need to recalibrate our strategy. because to be in the net by 2050, we'll be the third largest country in the world. Our population would have surpassed America, given the current trend, unless something happens and halts that trend. And so we cannot continue moving in infrastructure. In fact, our infrastructure is depleting faster than the replacement we're doing on it. So it's getting worse. We need to recalibrate. We need to, from a political lens, we need to analyze long-term plans, and we need to remove politics from infrastructure decisions. Infrastructure decisions should be primarily based on sound economics. We should learn how to prioritize. This issue of federal character in infrastructure development, it doesn't do us any good, because for instance, again, please understand me. For balanced development, it's important that infrastructure is developed everywhere, right? But we also need to be very careful, because I've been to locations where I've seen fantastic roads developed that lead to nowhere, just because an infrastructure just wants to be developed. Whereas that same infrastructure would have been developed in an area where there is a lot of economic activity, and it will bring in more spiral effect and cascade more impact on the people. So there needs to be a very careful balance when designing infrastructure projects. The second is institutional strengthening. We need the capacity of the public sector. The capacity of the public sector needs to be strengthened in the design, in the prioritization, in the resourcing of infrastructure projects. We have a lot of issues around transparency and accountability in infrastructure development and delivery in Nigeria. So we need to strengthen our institutions, because institutions are they are the rules of the game that will determine how actors behave in an economy. Naturally, actors will not behave normally. We need to start from that position, that actors will not naturally behave normally. We need to, as a matter of deliberate strategy, have strong institutions with the relevant legal, policy, regulatory frameworks that are there supporting those institutions to deliver on their mandate. Why would it take the judiciary about 10 years to deliver on a case that requires an infrastructure project? Right of way and the rest. We need to strengthen institutions. And to be honest, we should strengthen not just at the national or federal level, but also at subnational level. Because every infrastructure project is situated in a state. Every infrastructure project is situated in the local government. Even if you think it is in the FCT still has its own administration. So we must decentralize and democratize our approach to infrastructure development and delivery. It's very important, because planning at the federal level and very little planning for infrastructure development and delivery goes to the subnational level. I'll quickly move on for the purpose of time. We need to also look. We cannot fund. We need to have this. We need to appreciate the fact that we cannot fund our infrastructure ourselves. Let's not deceive ourselves. We do not have the resources as government to fund infrastructure ourselves. But we must be very innovative to tap into resources within the private sector for design, development, and delivery of infrastructure projects. Because there are significant innovative opportunities that can be unlocked from the private sector for delivering infrastructure projects. So we must explore, and we must be sincere. It shouldn't be about putting it on paper that we will leverage PPPs, traditionally how we do. We must be sincere about it. There must be the very strong political will to push through the delivery of leveraging PPPs for infrastructure delivery. We must look at innovative financing model. I don't know how many persons on this call know about the HDMI project. We have, well, if you've traveled some of these routes where they call the HDMI project, for instance, like the Abuja, Kefi, Lafia, down to Makurdi recently, you see what innovative financing has done on that road. And it's going to be told. And to be honest, we need to actually start tolling our roads. Because beyond the delivery of infrastructure, there is the maintenance part of it. There's the ongoing maintenance. And to do that, you need to generate resources. And that is how we can begin to get our roads back. Policy, we need to also align our national infrastructure goals with global standard. We cannot afford to continue to do things the same way, where we drop the standards. And then the cost of maintenance and repair becomes so exorbitant. So we need to ensure that our infrastructure, when we're developing and delivering infrastructure, it's in line with global standard, it's in line with best practice. We shouldn't cut the corners, we shouldn't drop the standard because it is Nigeria. Because in the long run, it's going to still be more expensive for us. So we must do it well and we must do it right. I think I will stop here. I have a bit more slides on that drills down to PPPs, but I will show just 2 more slides and then we'll open the floor for interaction. I just hope I've not taken too much time. Apologies. Yeah. So I just want to show you, yes, PPPs, I have a slide, but this is what I want to show you. Look at the global landscape in 1991 in terms of adoption of PPPs. This was 1991. Look at the global landscape. Anywhere you see red is where they at that time PPPs were already being adopted. PPPs in terms of attracting funding from the private sector to deliver public infrastructure. And then look at the landscape in 2021. How many countries have adopted PPPs? What you begin to realize is that something is working here and we shouldn't be left behind. We should leverage it properly. Yes, there are challenges to PPP. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't mean all your problems will go away. But with sincerity, with high political will, progress can be made. Let me stop by saying that the sort of future we want to see tomorrow, the sort of future that we will have in the next 10 years, will be determined by the strategic decisions we make today around our infrastructure. Infrastructure is the bridge between where we are today and where we will be in the next 10 years. And we need to make and be very decisive about that decision, and we need to do it very urgently. Thank you very much. Open the floor for questions.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was such an amazing session. You can literally hear the passion and interest in his voice as he was speaking. So if you have questions, please ask away. This is your time to ask questions. Please ask him questions, your opinions. Yes, Daniel, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, clearly.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Mike. So you mentioned something that I think so either Sandra or Busola that mentioned this yesterday as well, in terms of projects that are built in locations, and then you question why was this project built here. You mentioned the road. I think yesterday someone mentioned the airport that was built in a location. If I'm going to play the devil's advocate, how would you respond to the rationale of, maybe a political figure or maybe someone that was there when they were deciding on the project, and the person says, well, this project was decided to be done in this location to almost serve as a catalyst to kind of ignite economic activities. Yeah, right now there are not much things going on there, but the idea was that by virtue of building this infrastructure, we can now generate economic activities and things like that. So how would you respond to that kind of rationale? Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it makes sense to me. So thank you, Daniel. Just to give you some context, I have served in senior positions at the subnational and the federal level. I've advised key decision makers. So I clearly understand this argument you're putting forward. However, to be honest, typically when you say that, when you make that kind of an argument, it should be based on data, on evidence, on facts. If you put in a cargo airport, for instance, in a city, and your idea behind that is that you want to catalyze investments in that place, and I'll put this question back to you. you have this city where you, first of all, so it's really like putting the cart before the horse. You're building a cargo airport that you expect to be moving every day. You want it to be moving, possibly, for instance, yams from that particular town to, let's say, to the Middle East every day or maybe weekly, right? But you do not have the farmers who are going to cultivate that product are not empowered. They are still using local tools. They are still their farms are not contiguous. They are farming 1 hectare using local tools. They can't even produce the quality at the level that is required, right, to move this product out. So why not invest in what is critical at that point in time, and then you move progressively? That would be my argument, to be honest. If you say you want to construct a road to open up an existing area where there are significant number of farmers, I can agree with you. I'd say, no, this makes sense. But you want to construct a road, particularly because the resources are limited, right, Daniel? It's not as though there are no other areas where you can do some of these innovative projects. So the question is that the best use of that resource at that time? Are there other alternatives that will deliver more impact? So why would I build a cargo airport and wait for 5 years or 10 years for people to now catch up? Whereas I can design other projects that will bring out quick wins, and then we can leverage road transport to a neighboring state. For instance, one of the arguments I was putting forward then, when one of the cargo airports was being developed by a subnational, was, look, we share boundaries with other states where there are high agricultural production going on, right? Why are we not collaborating with these states? Why can't 4 states come together, collaborate, and set up one cargo airport? Why should all the individual states who are not even competitive fiscally build airport and increase their debt and their debt profile, where there are other ravaging issues or other more pressing issues? Because resources are not infinite. They are not, you don't have an infinite amount of resources, right? So you want to prioritize. Daniel, that would be my quick response. I hope that was quick.
No, that made so much sense. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Okay, Rachel, we are there.
All right, Rachel. Rachel has a question.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you very much, Mr. Mike, for your clear and very argumentative presentation. But most of what you said, I could hear a lot about funding and prioritizing, which I think is very important, not just even for like infrastructure, but like SDGs in general, because there's always a need, for balancing. And so that is like what I want to ask, because I think most of like the government's budget in Nigeria goes a lot into security issues. So like, how can the government prioritize, infrastructure, or like balance, what to prioritize between infrastructure and security challenges? Because, it's very obvious how, security is like a pressing need, like really pressing, because you're talking of life and death. So, when you talk of infrastructure, people are still trying to manage. There's a way to, manage your life, or try to get, if it's like surviving with food or whatever. But when you talk of security, you're about life and death situation. So how can the government, prioritize that? And yesterday in Busola's presentation, she made reference to the fact that infrastructure could be physical or it could be social infrastructure. Yeah. So when prioritizing infrastructure, what should we really look at? Are we looking at just economic benefits or economic impact? Or are we also looking at like peace, social, that's like the social infrastructure, like people, are we looking to improve the lives of people? So what exactly is the goal for when you're prioritizing infrastructure? Thank you.
Okay, so I'll start from the last question. When you're prioritizing infrastructure projects, because I've been part of processes of prioritization over the last couple of years. There are different criteria. This criteria cuts across different aspects, and it is a balancing act. It is not an exact science, because you're looking at different variables. First of all, you're looking at the viability of the infrastructure projects. You are looking at the impact. You are looking at the environmental considerations and climate considerations around that project, because these are important issues, right? You are looking at the cost of the projects. Because, for instance, if you want to do a project of $50 billion for one single project, and then you can do other smaller projects that would yield significant impact across the country, across the state, then you might need to rethink very well carefully. So you need to look, and then do you have the cost? So you need to look at the cost. You need to look at the time frame for delivery. You need to look at the job creation potentials of the project. So you need to create a bucket of criteria and considerations, and then you are assessing this project. But again, you also need to be honest, you also need to look at political balancing and considerations. Because the fact that it's not really viable because a community only has 2,000 people and another community has 100,000 people, that it makes sense to only construct roads to the 100,000. You know, there are political considerations you also need to still put in place, but it needs is a balancing act across the. You need to set out a broad range of criteria, and then it's an iterative process, and then you're looking at these different considerations, the argument for you across this stream, and then you're able to make an informed decision that way, right? So there are a couple of considerations that need to be put in place. Some might even score. So typically, sometimes you could use a scoring framework where you attach higher scores to certain elements than some other elements, and then you do your prioritization, and then come up with your score, weighted scoring, and you're able to see which project you should be going for. So delivering a project should not just be, you can't use one criteria. That, to just summarize my response, you can't use one criteria. It's a multi-criteria analysis that needs to be done, where you will have to look at different sort of variables to make the sort of decision that you need to make. Yeah, so I hope that helps. Yeah, there are other questions that you've asked, which is around infrastructure and security. Yeah, I've actually done a bit of research on that, right? There's this argument that security, it starves the nation of critical funds for developing other sectors. It depends on how. So one of the focus of my research was, look, how can we design our expenditure in the military or in the defense or in security sector to catalyze impact in other sectors? Because, to be honest, if you are not safe, you won't remember. If God forbid someone is trying to break into your house at night and you are hungry, the hunger will disappear immediately. You will remember you were hungry. At that point, it is survival that will be your focus, right? So security is important for you to thrive. For you to be able to access good healthcare, good education, you need security. Because without security, our children in the north, for instance, if there's no peace in some areas where there are insecurity, the children are not going to school. People can access health facilities. So security is important. These other social sectors are also very important. But we need to be able to, the question really, and this is where I think we should really think through as a country and as individuals, how do we design this expenditure on our security to ensure that there is a spillover effect, to ensure that it impacts on other sectors? And I'll give you an instance. A lot of the, if we industrialize our security sector, imagine we set up industries that produces a range of the military hardware that are required in the country, from their boots to even the gadgets, the the weapons, a large proportion of these, that will create jobs, that will earn us foreign exchange, that will improve the lives of people, because people need to work in those places. So it really depends on how you design the expenditure. For instance, in some economies, most of the expenditure in security go for imports. So that way it impacts on even your foreign exchange reserve in the bank. But imagine you've designed your expenditure in such a way that a lot of this expenditure in your security goes into, for instance, industrializing the sector. There will be spillover effects. Nothing stops the military, the security sector from building bridges because they need to access certain locations. And once they are done, those bridges are still available for economic activities. So there are significant opportunities. Yes, we shouldn't abandon other sectors. And security is also important. We need to think through how do we, first of all, balance expenditure across the sectors, but also how do we ensure that the expenditure, even in the security, has a significant spillover effect into the other sectors. We can be exporting military hardware to other African countries. That will earn us foreign exchange, but that will also boost our local economy, boost employment locally. Okay, I hope that helps. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. We will take one more question as our time is now passing. So we're going to take Onyedika's question and we'll go into the breakout rooms.
All right, thank you, Bishola. Thank you also, Mr. Mike. That was an instructive and quite energetic session. So my question is around, you had clearly stated that amongst the things to do that we need to optimize PPP, which is public partnerships. And it's more like, not really a direct question, but as an industry expert, I would really want to sample your opinion on, because we know the tax credit scheme, that allowed companies to develop infrastructure around their operational area, and on the long run, I think it exempts them from their income tax. So, would you say that this particular scheme has actually failed, or it's a work in progress? Because I can't really think of many projects that has been funded through this particular scheme, apart from, let's say, maybe the Oshodi Apapa Expressway by Dangote. Then I think there was one other project that was done by Globalcom. So, what's your, as an industry expert, what's your take on this particular scheme that saw the light of day but has not really lived up to its expectations in seeing that infrastructure development is improved in Nigeria?
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much for that question. And I'll keep it short. I know we don't have much time. I think it's a fantastic idea. In principle, I think it's a fantastic idea. But the real challenge we're having with that is that how many companies' balance sheet is strong enough for them to construct even a kilometer of road? A standard kilometer of road will cost you about $1 million. Let's take road, for instance. So that is why we're not really, the impact you're not seeing is a reflection of what is happening in the economy. There are two major, from my own, based on my experience in the space and what I've seen, I know there are a number of projects currently in the pipeline that would soon come up, but with what I've seen, over 80% of those projects are from two companies, Dangote and the NNPCL. And over the next 4 or 5 years, you'll see a lot of projects from these two, because I know they are still in the approval stages of those projects. I'm privy to them. So, but again, what would worry you really? Why just these two? But again, like I said, is the balance sheet. because infrastructure projects are expensive projects. So very few companies would have that sort of balance sheet to be able to, leverage the tax credit scheme. But it's a fantastic idea because it incentivizes the private companies to invest in infrastructure within their operating area. In principle, fantastic, but in practice, it just means that we need to. The more we strengthen our economy, because we can't have an economy where a lot of the companies we have locally are leaving the country because of some of the crisis around the dollar issue and the rest. Look at the profits. Look at the Nestle recently declared significant losses. Nigerian bottling company, go and look at their books. Companies are struggling under the under the weight of the devaluation that has happened due to the free floating of the naira. A lot of companies are struggling to even breathe. So there's no fiscal room for them in terms of there's no room for them fiscally to invest in infrastructure projects. So I think that is really the issue. The idea is good, but it's just a reflection of the economy. And as the economy improves and companies' balance sheet begins to improve, I think we'll begin to see more companies participating in that space. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mike, for the intervention and also for the insightful session. We will still have a Q&A session at the end. We really hope that everyone can stay to the end. We still have another amazing facilitator after now. But before we go into the next session, we're just going to go into the breakout room to discuss more about the things we have been discussing since yesterday. And for today, yesterday, our challenge was on if we can pick one SDG, how infrastructure development will impact on that SDG target. But today we are thinking about the infrastructure sectors, and the challenge is to discuss if we pick one infrastructure sector in Nigeria, what sort of practical actions can we take, whether from a political or financial point of view? What sort of actions can we take to improve this sector? And if we were to invest in this one sector, how will it improve sustainable development in Nigeria? So we'll open the breakout rooms now, and we would have 15 minutes to discuss and then come back to the general session to just share ideas before we go into the next session. So the breakout rooms are now open. Yes, sure, I'll do that. Can everyone see the breakout rooms so they can join their breakout rooms?
I can see mine.
Okay, yeah. Don't worry if you're not assigned yet, probably because you joined after the breakout rooms have been created. I will assign you manually. For co-host, if you check the base of your computer, you would see or your screen, you see the the 4 boxes where you can join any breakout room of your choice.
I tried to join the breakout room twice, but it just keeps sending me back to the main session.
Okay, let me see what the issue is.
Thank you.
I don't seem to figure out why. Could you try joining again and let's see if that works?
Yes, I'll do that. Thank you.
can't seem to figure out why it keeps tripping you off.
No, it's fine. It's not a problem. I don't think the breakout sessions are terribly long, so I actually don't mind just waiting until the end.
Do you want to log off and come into the room and see?
It's main thing. Okay, no problem. I'll just do that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Clean water and sanitation, and other states do not have it. So what are the solutions that can be done, right? Domesticating policies, international policies, and ensuring that these policies are well implemented. Another thing we talked about was ensuring that whatever infrastructure is constructed or put in place is inclusive and disability friendly. We also mentioned the fact that it should be maintained. So one of the problems we have in Nigeria is a maintenance problem, right? We put things in place, but years after we can see that they aren't always maintained, and it just goes back to how it started, right? So that's just a very, very short recap of what we did.
Okay, thank you so much, Tulumani. The ICT and Digital Revolution group. Anyone from the ICT group? Okay.
Yeah, I think I'll start by saying we had a lot to talk about, but the time was short. So we major more on the educational aspect, making sure that people are aware, just trying to, most especially in the rural part of Nigeria, that they are well educated. And we also focus a little on the content of the education aspect. What are people actually achieving, and how are we measuring the result? How are the results being measured? That is the impact on the people at large. We also focus a little bit on the health sector, how people how a lot of startups are also trying to bring in health and ICT together. And we cite some examples on some startups that are doing well regarding that they are doing very well. And that's what we talk about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Going to the power and energy. Anyone from that group able to tell us what you discussed?
Yep. We talked about the potential for decentralizing power generation in Nigeria. Someone raised the point of state-owned power stations, but there was also a question of, can states actually fund, finance, maintain power generation on a state level? Then we looked into, for example, climate action. Everyone is moving towards clean energy, and the big players in terms of technology are wind turbines and solar power. If we consider solar power, the best place to put solar power in Nigeria, number one, where you have high solar radiance, number two, where you have large spans of land. Which place is ticking these two boxes? It's the north. And it brought us back to Mr. Mike's point on security. Can we actually guarantee that if you have solar farms in the north, the session we had yesterday was on resilience. Infrastructure must be available 24/7, at least close to 24/7. Can we guarantee that if you have a solar farm in the north, you would actually be able to generate electricity consistently? Someone also talked about the potential of having floating solar farms. And then the counter to that was, hope this is not going to be interrupting local fishermen and ensure that we're not disrupting people's livelihoods. So that was a quick recap of what we talked about in our breakout session.
Amazing, thank you. And also the healthcare group, anyone?
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, I and my colleagues were able to outline some of the challenges, which include poor facilities, lack of funding, lack of human relation by the health personnel, lack of personnel that most of our doctors have JAPAs and the nurses. And we have poor accessible hospital, maybe or lack of hospital around the rural area and the likes. And some of the solutions we are able to outline is providing the fundings and increase the number of personnel, engaging the private sectors, governments, and other organizations in improving this infrastructure and build up on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And transportation.
Yes, thank you for the contribution.
Anyone from transportation?
Hi all. This is Ajibola. So apparently it was just myself and Elizabeth in the transportation. I'm not sure what the moderators were trying to achieve, but okay. In any case, we talked about several things. We didn't even get a chance to conclude on the practical ways, but we did talk about one thing, which is demanding accountability from our governments, right? Infrastructures are expensive, especially when it comes to transportation. They are ridiculously expensive. Is the money missing? Do we not have the capital? Maybe we don't. Can we attract the capital? Possibly. Institutional and private investors can invest in these projects. But then are there adequate risk returns for these investors to be able to calm down, see what needs to be done, and then do it? The answer is that there isn't sufficient risk return for most of them, and that is why these things are not happening. Obviously, we do have some negotiation power in terms of mineral resources that we can put on the table and then demand in exchange for development works. But unfortunately, there just seems to be that lack of political will. Solutions-wise, we highlighted the possibility of PPPs, which was earlier discussed as well in the call. We also talked about the possibility of using public policy as a tool to mandate the development of infrastructure in respective areas where it can attract sufficient human capital. Because that in itself is also another problem. There just seems to be this lack of manpower in various areas of the Nigerian economy, even in Africa at large. But yeah, that's like a very, very, very simple subset of what we discussed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, we have the Agriculture and Rural Development Group. Anyone from that group?
Hello. So I and Dennis Amata, we basically discussed like the issues, areas, and challenges within that particular sector, and like what are the policy considerations by the government. So some of the like issues we pointed out is like storage challenges because of like bad roads, and how that leads to high inflation and also like increased waste. We also discussed like irrigation challenges, so like lack of water supply, especially like during the dry season. And we also discussed access to agricultural mechanization services and technology, and how like farmers don't have, especially like local farmers do not have access to some mechanization tools, like for instance tractors, and some of the possible solutions or like strategies the government like should put into consideration. We talked about like access to loans, so funding, and then leveraging like local community associations, especially to provide like tractor services, or to engage more with like local farmers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thanks so much to everyone for your contribution. You guys had an amazing conversation. We should submit your name to the President's Cabinet so you can implement the solutions. I will pass it on to my colleague Towoju, who will continue with this session.
All right, thank you so much, Busola. Right, I agree. Everybody should submit their names to the president. But anyway, right about now, we are going to the final session for the workshop. Yay! All right, this is the final session for the workshop, and it's going to be taken by none other than Mayowa Abiru. Mayowa Abiru is a finance legal professional, and he has extensive experience advising on cross-border infrastructure, corporate and project finance transaction across Africa. And today he's going to be speaking to us on building Nigeria's infrastructure future. And with that, please make welcome Mayowa Abiru. I'm going to be sharing the slides. Just give me a minute.
Okay, thank you very much, Tojo, and good afternoon, everyone. Please let me know if you can hear me. Okay, thank you. So as the slides are coming up, just a quick introduction. My name is Mayowa, and I work as legal counsel at the AFC. Essentially, AFC is a multilateral development bank that was established by African countries to raise capital internationally and deploy that capital for infrastructure development on the continent, as well as to support governments through sovereign lending and just generally improve industrial capacity across Africa. And so till date, AFC has invested over $12 billion across Africa and across 36 countries specifically. So with respect to the general topic of the workshop, I think this is as close as anything to what I do, even though I do work in countries outside of Nigeria, but I'm Nigerian, and I think many people here are as well. So, the topic was one that was particularly interesting to me, and I must also commend InfraSpotlight as well as the Nigerian Youth SDG group for putting this together, and to all the moderators and facilitators as well. So with that brief introduction, this session is mainly going to focus on financing. I know that a number of sessions that we've gone through have spoken about how expensive infrastructure is and how sometimes the real challenge with infrastructure development is raising the kind of capital that is required to fund these very expensive projects. And so this session is going to focus on trying to provide you with a financier's perspective to financing infrastructure. My primary goal is to communicate with you and equip you with a sort of toolkit that will help you appreciate what makes a project bankable from the perspective of a financier. What is it that determines whether or not a financier is going to support a project, and what is it that would deter a financier from supporting a project? And my aim with this is such that when the government makes policy or makes proclamations subsequent to today, you would have an improved capacity to be able to analyze whether or not a project makes sense from a financial perspective. It can help you determine why certain projects were not successful or were not implemented. And it can also help you understand why other countries or certain countries seem to be making a lot of progress where infrastructure is concerned. So with that being said, I think that was a pretty long introduction. I think we can start. So Toju, next slide, please. So I've spoken briefly about this roadmap that I'm looking to follow, and we'll just quickly get started. We can move 2 slides forward, please. Okay, perfect. So it just seemed like it made sense to start with an introduction and quickly talk about SDG 9. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I'm sure Busola and so many other people have done justice to this. But essentially, the point here is the sustainable development goal around SDG 9 is that countries want to build sustainable and resilient infrastructure that's going to support their economic development. And in doing this, you want to make sure that infrastructure is sustainable because we need to protect and preserve the planet and industrialize in a way that is more efficient than what occurred in the mid-1950s, when a lot of industrialization generated a lot of environmental harm and damage. And so in doing this, the SDG 9 then has sub-targets that basically aim to guide implementation. And so the thing for governments here is, how do you align your policy and your decision-making such that you're working towards this? And in doing so, I think just some key points on this slide. You have to make sure you're increasing access to financial services for entrepreneurs in your country. You want to make sure that you're promoting inclusive and sustainable industrialization by prioritizing infrastructure investment. You also want to make sure that you're upgrading your industries for sustainability. Next slide, please. Okay, sorry, there's a bit of a lag with the slides. Please move a slide backwards. Okay, this is perfect. And so on this slide as well, it speaks about how any country that is seriously looking to actualize the attainment of SDG 9, you need to also be investing in scientific research and technological development. You also want to improve access to ICT for people generally. Told you can move to the next slide, where I'm just going to sum up the key message that I'm trying to pass across with this. So the key message that I want to pass across with this quick introduction on SDG 9 is this. When we talk about infrastructure, and the word is used a lot, it can tend to get pretty vague. And so something I like to do is to dimension what we mean when we talk about this. When we talk about infrastructure, we're basically talking about the bedrock of your society and your economy that you're going to build upon. And we're talking about social infrastructure that includes your hospitals, your schools, your public utilities like your libraries and your parks. But we're also talking about critical infrastructure for your economy. And that would include things like your energy sector, so your power plants, your hydroelectric power plants. We're talking about things that will boost your economic competitiveness. So we talk about transportation as well, like your railways and your road networks. We also speak about refineries and natural resources. And basically, we're talking about elements of your economy that will enable your economy to function and enable goods and services produced in your country to be competitive on a global scale. No, previous slide, please, still. And so essentially, I've itemized 4 key objectives that I'm looking to achieve with this session, and particularly the bottom 3. I think on the first objective, the ability to identify where SDG 9 is in Nigeria today in terms of progress and shortfalls, I think a lot of speakers would have done justice to that, and Mike also spoke to it at the beginning of his session. But particularly, sorry, I think there's someone that isn't muted. Particularly, I want to speak about the bottom 3 objectives, which are, I want to ensure that we understand a financier's approach to assessing infrastructure projects. I also want to make sure that we understand what the challenges are with financing infrastructure in Nigeria specifically. And finally, most importantly, what are some crucial steps to financing the future of Nigeria's infrastructure? So that's the plan. And hopefully we can cover all of that within the time we have allocated. Next slide, please. So again, this is an introductory slide. Mike also had a similar slide, and this is really just to show you where things are currently. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I'm sure a lot of us here live in Nigeria. A lot of people have already spoken about the challenges. At the top left, you see that Nigeria has the largest population in Africa, over 200 million people. But when you look at the right, where you measure the infrastructure development index, you see that Nigeria scores quite low relative to these other countries that have even a lower population. So you see that there's a mismatch there. You have the higher population where you should have the greater extent of infrastructure development, but you're then coming in at the bottom on the other end. The bottom slides show you per capita electricity consumption, because no economy can really improve without power. And a lot of things depend on how much how easily and cost effectively you can access energy. At the bottom right, I speak about internet penetration because, like Mike said, we're increasingly moving towards a digital world. And the internet is really an enabler of opportunity because it affords people living in Nigeria with the opportunity to innovate outside of government assistance. It affords people opportunities to connect with the globe. And Nigeria's internet penetration, currently at about 42%, is below the average across Africa. Next slide, please. Finally, to wrap up this snapshot slide, we have the Global Competitiveness Index, which I think Mike also spoke to. And what this basically measures, it's a tool that captures how well goods and services produced in a country are able to compete with goods and services produced in other countries. And what determines whether or not you're going to be competitive on a global scale is largely attributable to the cost of your production and how well you're able to transport your goods internationally. If you're producing something like cocoa in Nigeria and it's costing you significantly more to produce your cocoa than it's costing someone in Ghana to produce cocoa, when you get into international commodities markets, that producer from Ghana is going to be able to charge a cheaper price and is going to capture significantly more market share. And so what this tool shows you is that because of the infrastructure challenges, goods and services produced in Nigeria are typically not able to compete well on a global scale. And so for a country that is trying to raise a significant amount of foreign exchange income, if you can't compete on a global scale, you can't sell your goods on a global scale, you're going to struggle to do this. And I think the best example to use is Nigeria's crude oil. So since the 1960s, Nigeria has been considered one of the largest oil producers in the world. But there's always been an issue. Nigeria lacked refining capacity. And so what used to happen was we were extracting crude oil and then exporting that. That was then getting refined internationally and then getting unsold. And so we were not capturing a lot of the value. Sure, we'll make some money from exporting the crude oil. But if you had beneficiation in your country and you could refine products into petroleum, diesel, and other spirits, you would be able to capture significantly more market share and earn significantly more income. Our own situation was particularly comical because we were exporting the crude oil and then using half of the earnings we were making to buy the refined products back. And this is not the case with many other countries that had crude oil. A lot of those countries invested in refining capacity so that they could capture international market share. And that's why even when the prices of crude oil skyrocketed about 2 years ago, or 1 year ago with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, Nigeria wasn't one of the countries that was benefiting greatly from that because we did not have the refining capacity to benefit from it, essentially. So that just shows you how far this infrastructure challenge can really impact on the country. And today we're talking about the exchange rate, we're talking about FX scarcity. All of these things are interconnected. Particularly on the right side, you have a chart that shows you the percentage of GDP that goes into infrastructure investment. And again, you see Nigeria not necessarily leading the pile on that point. And then at the bottom, I've tried to just summarize what the current state is. And basically, if you look at that, you will see that because of the challenges that we have in our transport, in our electricity, with our internet infrastructure, with our railways, with our natural resources, Nigeria has not historically been able to compete on a global scale. And for a country that has a significantly larger population than any other African country, one then tends to wonder what the plan is going forward because that population growth is not decreasing. So I think that's a good place to stop the introduction. Now we're going to move into what is particularly interesting to me and hopefully to you as well, the financing, because I'm sure we're all aware of the issues. We spend a lot of time talking about the issues. Does it make you happy? Does it make any of us happier? So we can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so perfect. Infrastructure financing in Nigeria, and this is what I do. I'm a legal professional. I also have a finance degree, and so this is something that I particularly find exciting. As we've said, infrastructure financing is very expensive. And so the way I've chosen to start talking about the challenges and prospects of financing infrastructure in Nigeria is to try to help you understand what the sources of this financing are, the tools that we use to deploy this financing, and the main stakeholders that are involved. Now, that's not to say this slide is exhaustive. I've tried to just prioritize some of the main ones. And unfortunately, I need to speak a bit quickly because we do have quite a bit to get through. But if at any point you think I'm speaking too fast, please, one of the facilitators, please let me know. So we'll talk about the sources of financing for infrastructure projects. You can't get away from it. The public sector is a key element of any infrastructure project you're going to do. And in many countries, one of the primary sources of funding is government revenue that the government has generated through taxes and other income that it has then budgeted and said, this is what we're going to spend on infrastructure. We also have the private sector because private entities sometimes spot opportunities where through investing in infrastructure, they can create value both for themselves and for society. We have development finance institutions. These are specialized financial institutions that have been created to mobilize financing for infrastructure. And I'm sure it's no surprise that I've used the AFC as an example in my slides, but we also have institutions like the African Development Bank, Afreximbank, and the World Bank. You also have sources of financing in international aid and grants. These are basically aids that are provided to struggling countries by international organizations. We have pension funds. Pension funds, what they do is they pull capital from the working class, and they have these massive sources of capital that they need to invest over very long horizons so that they earn a stable income. And so they like to invest in infrastructure projects, but they're not going to invest unless they find viable infrastructure projects to invest in. Finally, we have sovereign wealth funds, which are basically rainy day funds of countries. Whenever countries have surplus income, they invest these this income through their sovereign wealth funds into things that will generate revenue for future generations. And the Nigerian Sovereign Wealth Fund is the NSIA, the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority. We also have climate financing, which is a bit of a newer area, but there's a lot of financing available in the world today for sustainable infrastructure. So those are some of the sources of this financing that we talk about. But how is this financing deployed? When you have the financing, this financing is often deployed through public-private partnerships that I wouldn't explain anymore because I think we all understand what that is now. It's also deployed through project finance. Project finance is basically when you're financing a specific project, knowing that your loan is going to get repaid by that project. And so if the project is not successful, it basically means you're not going to get repaid or you're going to have issues with your repayments. We also have infrastructure bonds and other debt securities. And this really refers to when a sponsor, when we say sponsor, we mean the entity that is spearheading the development of that project, typically the government, but sometimes also private individuals. Infrastructure bonds are basically securities where you've gone into the capital markets to say people should invest in this project and you will repay them over a period of time. And a good example is the Nigerian Sukuk bond, where the government raised money for specific infrastructure projects. Another example is the foreign currency denominated bond that Nigeria just issued. So Nigeria issued a $500 million bond about 2 months ago, one of the very first foreign currency bonds issued by the country. And the aim of this bond was to raise funds that would be invested in infrastructure. Again, AFC acted as global coordinator on that bond, and it was one of the I guess, highlights of the past couple of months for us. You also deploy financing through syndicated loans. Syndicated loans are basically just loans that a group of financial institutions have come together to provide because a single institution is not prepared to take on all the risk of the project. We also have concessional loans, which are basically cheaper loans or loans that are not basically informed by a profit-making motive. And finally, we have grants and subsidies similar to international aid. Finally, on the right, we have the key stakeholders, and these are pretty self-explanatory. The key stakeholders in any infrastructure project, you're going to deal with national governments and municipalities. You're going to deal with private companies. You have development banks, also commercial banks. You have institutional investors, and you have international donors. It's important to note these stakeholders because these stakeholders typically have different incentives and different motivations. For the government is trying to finance infrastructure as cheaply as possible because they want to generate social welfare and they want to be popular. For private companies, they're trying to finance infrastructure, but their main motivation is profit making. They want to generate profits that they would upstream to their shareholders. For development banks, a lot of the time, your incentive is your development mandate. And so you want to finance projects in the countries where you're operational. Commercial banks, they're looking to make money and invest in projects that are going to be profitable. Similar to institutional investors, but finally, international donors and agencies, they are typically looking to support struggling nations that really need some help with the funding that they have available. Next slide, please. So perfect. So what this slide does, actually this slide and the next one is, we've spoken about where you can raise financing from. We've spoken about the tools that you use to deploy this financing and the key stakeholders. This slide is about to explain to us what makes the financing of infrastructure projects so peculiar. Because we've said it's very expensive, yes, but there are other things that are also very expensive. Financing the acquisition of a company is very expensive. Financing the acquisition of commodities like crude oil is very expensive. But what is it about infrastructure projects that makes them particularly difficult to finance? Firstly, is capital intensity. Infrastructure projects are extremely costly. I have 2 examples on the slide. The Lagos-Ibadan Railway costs more than $1.5 billion. The Dangote refinery, I didn't even put a figure there because people dispute the figure, but that refinery costs well over $15 billion. So infrastructure projects are terribly expensive to fund. For context, the entirety of Nigeria's budget this year is about 26 trillion naira. If you convert that to dollars, that's hardly $15 billion. So you could almost say that the entirety of that budget cannot even develop Dangote's refinery. And so that should make you understand that infrastructure is not something that the government can finance by itself. It's extremely expensive. When you think about power plants, you think about airports, you think about highways. I think Mike spoke quite a bit about how expensive it is to finance even a single kilometer of roads. If you look into the numbers that they're talking about for financing the Calabar Coastal Highway, it would actually blow your mind. But we'll talk about that separately. A second point is, outside of the capital intensity, infrastructure projects have very long payback periods. If you go to a bank and you say you want to finance the acquisition of a home, you want to buy a property for yourself, they'll give you a loan. Maybe they will require you to repay back in 10 years. If you finance the acquisition of a car, maybe they will require you to pay back in 7 years or something of that sort. With infrastructure projects, you're looking at payback periods of up to 30 years sometimes before you get your money back as a financier. And so for you as the lending financier, you have to be very comfortable with the project, because imagine a project you finance over a 20-year duration. In 20 years, you're going to have at least four different presidential elections. You're going to have changes in government. You're going to have changes in law. People are going to change jobs. The people you were dealing with when you started financing the project, some of them would have moved on to other things. They will not be there after 5 years. Some people, unfortunately, will have passed away, because that's just the reality of life. So these things are very long. And so you cannot finance infrastructure from a relationship perspective. And that's something that we struggle with sometimes. People come to the AFC, they want to raise money for projects. And they say to you, oh, but look at the sponsor of this company. This man is a billionaire. He has 20 billion naira. He's done this, he's done that. But then you're financing a project over the next 20 years. You don't know where that person is going to be in 10 years. So you can't finance infrastructure on the basis of individuals. You can't finance infrastructure because the current president is your friend, or because you're in good cahoots with APC. Things can change, and projects are very long-term. And I give some examples of that as we move forward. Related to that point, long construction periods. Infrastructure projects take quite some time to get off the ground. The average refinery is taking you about 3 to 4 years to build. Average airport taking you about 2 years to build. It's not a short-term play. And you have to always take into account that there will be time spent on construction. I give an example here of the Mambila hydroelectric power station that's in Taraba State. This project has been ongoing for over 30 years. It still hasn't been fully completed today, and there are a lot of reasons for that. I also speak about technical expertise. The financing of infrastructure requires significant technical expertise. It's not like buying a car. If you go to your bank, you say you want to raise money to buy a car, the questions they'll ask are very straightforward. As long as you're going to pay back, they're less concerned. If you say you want to finance a refinery, you're going to require at least 30 different technical professionals, from legal professionals to engineers. You're going to require finance professionals. You require environmental and social professionals, because a single significant mistake that affects the ability of that refinery to produce, you will never get paid back. And so the technical expertise required for developing finance projects, infrastructure finance projects, is considerable. Next slide, please. Okay, I think I need to move a bit quicker. I apologize. It's just quite a bit to get through. This is the final slide on the features of infrastructure financing and what makes it particularly peculiar. Legal and regulatory hurdles. If you're financing a single infrastructure project, sometimes you can be dealing with up to 4 regulators. You can be dealing with up to 15 different laws. I'll give you an example. If you want to finance a refinery in Nigeria, you have to start thinking first and foremost, the licenses you need. You're going to be dealing with the Department of Petroleum Resources. You're going to be dealing with both the upstream and downstream regulator, depending on how extensive your refinery project is. You're going to think about land acquisition. You're going to be dealing with the state government in the states where you need to acquire that land. You're going to be dealing with the CBN because you're importing capital. You're going to be dealing with the Nigeria Import Promotion Commission because you're going to have to get tax exemptions. You're going to have to get favorable tax regimes. You're going to be dealing with lenders. You're going to be dealing with security registration. So you can see how many different facets are involved on even one single project. And any of these can significantly delay your project. I give an example of the Deep Sea Port project in Lekki today. That project was delayed by, I think, over 3 years because they had regulatory issues. And with each year of delay, the cost of that project is going up, as you can imagine. You also have political and governance risk, which I think is self-explanatory. If you've invested 300 million to the financing of an airport today, and there's a change in government, and the government comes tomorrow and says, well, I don't believe in this project. The previous administration, they didn't know what they were doing, and they expropriate your project. As a financier, you have lost significant value. I'll give an example. One of the deals we did a lot of work in Gabon. AFC has invested significantly in special economic zones in Gabon. And I don't know if you watched the news, you realize that there was a military coup in Gabon a few months ago, I think about a year ago. And immediately we started to panic because you start to think to yourself, how do you even engage with a military government? Who is an AFC employee that are going to tell, we need to send you to Gabon to go and lead a dialogue with the new military government that has come into power? And this is a military government that is criticizing the previous administration with whom you've worked on this investment. So that's just an example of why it's very peculiar. Finally, we talk about public-private coordination, very important for PPPs. Public and private sector individuals have different incentives. If they cannot coordinate properly, you have issues with your project. And also, to close out everything, you have bankability. Bankability is really what encaptures everything that a financier is interested in. And I'm going to refer to this word a few times. What it means for a project to be bankable is basically for that project to be financially viable to a point where it can repay the cost of funding that you're going to take to finance it. That is it in a nutshell. If a project is bankable, it means if I invest $100 million in this project, I will get my 100 million back, no issues. But now that bankability is comprised of a lot of things. It comprises revenue generation, your risk assessment, the legal framework, the sponsor expertise, government support. It involves so many things that determine whether or not you're going to get your money back as a financier. And I'm not even yet talking about the returns you're hoping to make. Let's even just talk about whether you get the principal back. So we can move to the next slide. I feel like now that we've spoken about what makes the financing of infrastructure peculiar generally, I think for a lot of us here, particularly those of us that are Nigerian, an idea should already be forming in your mind. No, you could stay on the challenges. An idea should already be forming in your mind on why the financing of infrastructure in Nigeria will be particularly challenging. And hopefully that resonates with you, because what it means is you're already developing a sense of what a financier is thinking about before it provides financing in any country. I closed off talking about bankability on the previous segment. I'll start by talking about bankability again. If a project is going to be bankable, it means that the amount you're investing in that project, you should be able to get it back along with your return. And this can be affected by any number of things. If you have a change in government that ruins your project, you won't get your money back. If you have, something like currency risk and there's a huge devaluation and the project cannot service its loans, you won't get your money back. If the government revokes your licenses, let's say you finance a power plant and they revoke your license, that power plant is done. You will never make your money back. And so for financial institutions that finance infrastructure projects, it's not enough to say, oh, we need the private sector to support us. The private sector, them too, they are also God's children. They're not giving you free money for you to just go and do with things that are not going to generate a return, because eventually those financial institutions will also go bankrupt. And so to talk about the specific challenges with financing infrastructure in Nigeria, I've put up 12 on the slide, but there are a few more. And I think Mike also spoke to a few of these. Firstly, we have the legal and regulatory hurdle. Also, I don't plan to spend too much time talking about the challenges. I want us to focus more on the way forward. We have the legal and regulatory hurdles. I don't think it's a secret to anybody that we have legal issues in Nigeria. I give an example of the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway. That project, I went to Babcock University for my first degree. Babcock is in Ogun State. I had to go through this road for 5 years going to Babcock. That road was under construction for the 5 years I was in Babcock. The reason this will be the case is because the road is getting constructed in segments and they are having land disputes in different segments that are stalling the project. And so if you have an economy, you have a jurisdiction where there are so many legal and regulatory hurdles, as a financier, think about it from the perspective of an international institution or an international bank. There are more than 150 countries in this world. Why would you take your capital that is so precious to you and invest it in a country that has so much legal and regulatory uncertainty? And that's the way you need to think about it. Countries struggle for competitiveness with attractive financing. It's not that these institutions don't know what to do with money. Different countries come to you every day with different projects that they would like to execute. Every government wants to be popular. And so for the financier, you're looking for the most stable project that is guaranteed to give you back your return. We also speak about currency risk. Nigeria's currency has been devalued by over 300% in the past 5 years. And so if you think about it from the perspective of a lender that has financed a project, and this project is going to generate revenue in Naira. So let me give you the typical example. You finance infrastructure projects mostly in dollars. So let's say someone tells you, oh, AFC, come and finance I'm trying not to use a real example. Someone tells you to come and finance a power project. And they say to you, give me $200 million to finance a power plant. And you give them that money. The person that has built the power plant in Nigeria is earning their own income in Naira, but they need to pay you back in dollar. And so imagine you financed this project in 2017, maybe the exchange rate then was maybe 400 Naira to a dollar. Now the exchange rate is about 1,700 Naira, depending on who you ask. I can guarantee you that company is going to be experiencing immense financial pressure and they might not be able to service the loan. So in any country where you have significant currency risk, it's always an issue to finance infrastructure there because a lot of the time, the company is making money in local currency. You have, okay, I want to tell a funny anecdote on this point, even though I know I don't have too much time. There was a financial model I saw once where in a financial model, you're basically projecting how a project is going to do over the next maybe 20 years. And you have to make assumptions because you don't know what's going to happen in that period. So a lot of the time you have to assume, okay, assuming the currency is devalued to this level, what will happen if it devalues to that level? You take a best case scenario, your base case, and your worst case. And I remember at the time, the worst case scenario for Nigeria's currency, I think they had assumed that the naira would be devalued to about 950 naira to a dollar by 2026. This is 2024 and it's 1,730. So you can imagine what that project will be going through today. That was their worst case, by the way. Again, you have corruption and grafts. The reality is nobody's going to finance your projects in a country where there is extreme corruption. We have the P&ID scandal that is very well reported. The world is a global village today. Nothing is hidden. If you're playing games in your country with corruption, I saw something recently about a former governor that is being wanted for 80 billion naira worth of theft and fraud, basically. From the perspective of a banker sitting in his office in London, he's going to be asking you, like, is this possible? He will call his colleagues that are Nigerians and say, what is going on in your country? Why should this even be possible? And then you go and meet that same banker and say you want him to come and finance projects in your country. It just simply will not happen. We also have the rule of law. I was at a conference yesterday. The Attorney General of the Federation was speaking and people kept asking him questions about the rule of law. In any country where you don't have the rule of law being sacrosanct, people are not going to want to invest in your country because you can simply wake up tomorrow and turn their project on its head. And I give an example of the 2016 DSS raid on the homes of judicial officers that showed people having thousands of pounds in their cupboard. And you expect investors to be confident that your legal system will protect their rights. I speak about the ease of doing business, which I think we all know about. If it's not easy to do business in a country, you can attract investment easily. Please move to the next slide. Gosh, I need to move really quickly. Finally, on this slide, I talk about fiscal irresponsibility, and this is just about government seriousness. If you're not a serious government, if you're irresponsible with how you use your own funds, nobody is going to give you their own funds to invest in infrastructure. If you're spending your money on private jets, you're spending your money on ships and things like that, it's not going to be encouraging to anyone to support you. I speak about global perception. If you don't improve your image as a country, I give an example of the recent seizure of presidential jets by some Chinese investors. These things, all bankers pay attention. I feel like people don't appreciate that. Nobody watches the news more than bankers. Nobody is paying attention to the news more than bankers. A lot of the time, we think a lot of the funny things we do them here. But people are very well aware. Sometimes I work on deals with other financial institutions from Switzerland, and they are asking you things that are happening in your own country that you would have never thought they were aware about. And that's just the reality. I talk about the debt service burden. I think Mike spoke about this. If you have most of your budget going into debt service, you have very, very limited capacity to take more loans to fund infrastructure or to invest in infrastructure by yourself. I'll move quickly to the next point, or to the next segment rather. Okay, thank you very much. So the next segment, most important, we're talking about building Nigeria's infrastructure future and how do you finance this? And so what I was going to do was I was going to give you my own ideas on what I think the country needs to do to attract more financing. And then I thought to myself, but wait, we just elected a government last year. This government should also have ideas. How do they plan to attract investment? So I went online and I found the government's manifesto for attracting infrastructure investment. And that's really what you have here, Nigeria's infrastructure investment plan, before I speak about my own suggestions. And so with everything that we've spoken about until this point, hopefully, when we look at what the Nigerian government is saying it's going to do, you yourself, you should be able to assess whether these things are going to address some of the challenges we've highlighted. So the government says that it's going to improve road and transport networks, it's going to boost energy, it's going to expand digital connectivity. It's also going to address financing challenges through innovative funding solutions like accessing pension funds, private investments, and diaspora bonds. If you remember, we spoke about this on the sources of financing, and that was before I had even come across this document. The government also says it's going to ensure transparency and accountability, and I think Mike spoke about this in project execution. Now, more specifically, and I'm going to just pick on a number of these points. On budgetary reform, the government says it's going to ensure fiscal responsibility. 2 slides ago, we're talking about fiscal irresponsibility. It says it's going to free up resources for capital expenditure. On the previous slide, we're just talking about debt service capacity. The government says it's going to address corruption and waste and reduce the cost of governance. I think we spoke about that just now on challenges. On the power sector, the government says it's going to electrify rural areas and it's going to improve efficiency. In oil and gas, we say we're going to increase domestic crude production and harness our gas potential while also utilizing PPP structures. Next slide, please. The government also says that on transportation, it's going to construct a national highway system. We're going to modernize our ports and prioritize aviation. In digital infrastructure, we're looking to implement a national broadband plan. We're also going to train and build human capacity. In industrial policy, we're going to invest in local manufacturing and beneficiation. I think I spoke about beneficiation when I spoke about why we're not making money from our crude oil exports as we should. On agriculture, the government says it's going to improve security and address communal clashes while also improving access to finance. So that was very quick, but I think just by looking at the points that I've highlighted, it's quite clear that the government is not unaware of what the challenges are. And a lot of these suggestions that are contained in the government's Renewed Hope agenda would typically actually address some of those challenges. So it's clear that this thing is not really rocket science. It's not that difficult. But a lot of where we struggle is with implementation and political will, because you can have the smartest people. Nigeria has some of the smartest people in the world. I'm currently working on a project with McKinsey, and this is McKinsey globally in the world. And the partner that is leading that project, her name is Maiwa, she's a Nigerian. So Nigeria has a lot of smart people, but the issue is when it comes to implementation and political will, are we really getting it right? And so please move to the next slide. This is where I talk about what I feel are some of the key action items that the country should be taking. And you'll notice a bit of overlap. I speak firstly about institutional and governance reform. Anybody that knows me will tell you this is something I talk about all the time. I get very irritated when I look at how the governance structure of Nigeria is run. I think it's one of the most inefficient things I've ever seen in my life. And I don't even know if I should be saying that in such strong words, but it's something I'm particularly passionate about. And so I've suggested here that on the first note, we need to consolidate and reduce administrative inefficiency in the government. Because if you have a government that is eating up most of your funding and your expenditure, not only will you not be effective in implementing anything, you're also going to be wasting resources. Now, this is something that successive governments have said they were going to look into. There's something called the Oroshire report that every 4 years is tossed around. It was tossed around again about a couple of months ago, but it's hardly really implemented. I speak about the judiciary and the rule of law because the reality is in any jurisdiction where people don't feel safe and don't feel as though the judiciary is independent, people are not going to be confident to invest their money there. And on this, I say that there's a need to modernize our court processes. There's a need to invest in the quality of our judicial officers, and there's a need to improve the quality of our rulings. I saw a headline this morning that actually made me quite impressed. I saw that 2 judges have been suspended in Anambra and in Rivers State for inappropriate behavior, basically, in how they were issuing judgments with respect to a number of the government issues going on there. We need more of that, because if people don't trust that your judiciary is independent, if they don't trust that there's rule of law, nobody's going to invest. If someone asks you to put your own money in a country where the government can wake up tomorrow and destroy your project, and you go to the court and the court tells you, tough luck, try again, you would rather put your money in another country. If you look at America, a lot of people have different views about Donald Trump as a president. But for all the supposedly erratic things that Donald Trump did during his first term, America's institutions are considerably strong to a point where one individual cannot really torpedo the entire system. And so that's why a lot of the government was still able to function as it should have, notwithstanding that there were policy issues potentially at the top. And that's what we need in Nigeria. We need systems that are strong enough such that regardless of who the president is, regardless of who the governor is, the court system is still doing its job. And that's what it should be. I speak about anti-corruption because, again, in Nigeria, we have serious corruption issues. And one of the suggestions I make here is that we need publicized plea bargaining. Yesterday, the Attorney General said, well, a lot of our efforts in anti-corruption were going into prevention. And that's why you're not really hearing about a lot of things that we're doing. We're getting people to refund monies that they've stolen, and we're not really going to court because court takes a lot of time. But if you don't publicize this, if you don't name and shame people, what's the incentive to stop people from doing it again? If I'm a governor and I steal 20 billion and I know that if EFCC should hold me, I'll just give them back 10 billion and I'll move on with my life. Why am I disincentivized to be corrupt? I speak about strengthening our institutions and automation and minimizing the extent of human influence on government processes. When people talk about government bribes and how those bribes and bribe-seeking officials hinder development, it's because there's a lot of human influence. There are a lot of processes we have in Nigeria today that should be automated. you need to get certain approvals. You need to go and see certain people in Abuja. And I've experienced this personally on different projects. I don't understand why I need to go to Abuja to meet with certain people for things that ordinarily should be very straightforward. If you remove that opportunity, a lot of the hindrances that people create where they are seeking bribes or they're seeking undue advantage, you kind of address those points. Next slide, please. I talk about long-term economic policy and stability. This is something that Rwanda has done very well. This is something that Morocco has done very well. Infrastructure is a long-term play. Every country needs to have an infrastructure roadmap of what you're trying to achieve over 4, 8, 10 years. It cannot be the case that every 4 years, each successive government has different ideas for what they want to prioritize, because infrastructure has to be a long-term play. Infrastructure has been very successful in Rwanda because they've had, I mean, on the one hand, they've had the same president for a very long time, which people can have different views about that. But what that has also done is at least you know what this person is prioritizing. So it's easy to channel funding because you know that over the next 4, 8 years, this will continue to be a priority of the government. Nobody wants to invest in something and then 4 years later, there's a new government and it's not prioritized any longer. I talk about fiscal responsibility. I've spoken about that already. Government spending needs to be called into question. It needs to be checked. There needs to be checks and balances, and that's related to accountability of public officials. Very recently, the Tinubu administration fired certain ministers, and I thought that was commendable because historically in Nigeria, we've had the situation where you have public officials that are hardly evaluated. There's hardly a company you work for today where they don't do performance evaluations, but in our public sector, we hardly do that. A minister can be in office doing nothing for 4 years. That person is never evaluated, never removed, and you have 4 years of no progress. I speak about access to local currency funding, but this is a very technical point. I'm not entirely sure we'll have the time to speak about that. How many more slides do we have, please? I think, okay, one more slide. So let's speak about the next slide, please. On the next slide, I speak about strengthening checks and balances. On this, I say that we need to minimize the influence of the executive, and basically you need to minimize the influence of strong people. You need to invest more in stronger institutions and less in strong individuals, because strong individuals can subvert processes. Strong institutions will withstand corrupt individuals to a certain degree. I also speak about financial, legal, and regulatory reform. A lot of the issues that we have with attracting financing today, it's because of the issues that we have with our legal and regulatory sector. If you want to register security today, you've given a loan, it's very expensive, it's very stressful, it takes a lot of time. If you even go to a local law firm, you speak to a Nigerian law firm, you say that you've provided a loan of $200 million to a Nigerian company, but you want to register your security. They'll be telling you that, we don't think you should register the security for the entire 200 million. Let's see if we can do it this way. Let's see if we can. And that's because we have issues with the process. I also speak about foreign investment protection. If you don't protect foreign investment, nobody is going to want to invest in your country. We have a lot of news about countries pulling out of Nigeria. I mean, of course, some of them are pulling out for other reasons, but also some of them have had their fingers burnt. There are people that have come here and invested significant money. I mean, we also saw the landmark issue very recently where the Lagos state government had to reclaim a lot of land from people that had invested millions or hundreds of millions of dollars in the Oniru area of Lagos state on hospitality ventures. People pay attention to these things. And so when people see that, oh, that's what has happened to that person, and the government then comes to send an envoy to you and they say, please come and invest in our hospitality, the first thing you're going to say to them is, you want me to become the next so. I would rather take my money to Rwanda. I'd rather take my money to Egypt. I'd rather take my money to Morocco. And finally, I talk about developing viable PPP projects. In our PPP sector, there are a lot of issues, and Mike is the expert on this, but in my own personal experience, we have issues with transparency. We have issues with different incentives from the private and the public sector. And historically, there hasn't been a lot of transparency in how PPP projects have been awarded. And long-term government support has also been an issue. It's one thing for the government of the day to support your project. In 4 years, it could be a different story. And finally, I speak about the global image and investor confidence. This seems like a minor point, but it really is not. Global perception is a huge factor in how you raise financing. As AFC, we're constantly going to international lenders, we're going to international markets, appealing to people to come and invest money in African projects. They will tell us that we'll invest the money in you, so that if we don't get our money back, you will be on the hook to pay us back, because a lot of the time they don't have that confidence in the countries in which you're going to invest that funding. And I mean, fortunately, I think things are improving across the board with a bunch of African countries. I wish things were improving as quickly with Nigeria. That hasn't been my experience as at yet. But hopefully, as things continue to progress, we continue to improve our global image and we present the image of a country that is serious about our own development, such that people can believe in our story and also commit their own financing to our own infrastructure future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mayowa. That was an immersive session, if you would agree with me. Right. So if you have questions for Mayowa, please kindly raise your hand and we'll take the questions. Yes, exactly. It was a very insightful session. Okay. All right. So to take the question and answer, all right, Ajibola, I see your hand, but just a minute. I'm going to invite Boluwatife Ajayi from our. Okay, Busola, I see your hand. So I'm just going to invite Boluwatife Ajayi from the Nigeria Youth SDGs, our partner for this workshop, to take the question and answer session. Boluwatife, the floor is yours. Boluwatife, can you hear me? Okay, while we wait for Bolu, Ajibola, can we have your question?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Mayowa. Thank you for all of the information that you've provided to us. My question is very, very simple because I happen to also work in finance, right? This is something that I've also done all my life. And I understand all of your points regarding risk return, investor confidence, and all of that. My question is very simple, right? Given your experience and insights into what the AFC is doing and is trying to do, and given all of your experiences dealing with the Nigerian government and all of that, do you think that Nigeria can make it in the next 30 years? It's a very simple question. Do you genuinely, given what you've experienced so far? I know it's a very dicey one because, I mean, we know how financial models work, right? It's all about assumptions. We have to think about what can happen in 50 years' time, in 10 years' time. But given your own experience into the situation with the Nigerian government, all of these things we're talking about cannot happen without political will. You need strong political will. So, and I've never worked in the Nigerian government sector. I've not had any experience with any of them, and I'm kind of not praying to. But anyway, do you think Nigeria can make it with this current crop of leaders? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, can I answer the question?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Joel. That's an interesting question. I'll first start by saying that Nigeria is a member state of the AFC, so you need to take that into account as I'm going forward. But jokes aside, when you say, do I think Nigeria can make it? I think that's quite broad because when you say make it, is that, okay, can Nigeria be a success over the course of the next 30 years? But I'll try to answer and I'll say this. As you said, political will is instrumental in anything you want to achieve. Historically, we've had a lot of issues with that in Nigeria. The current administration in Nigeria does have political will to do certain things. I mean, the administration has taken some very difficult decisions, like removing the fuel subsidy, things that should have probably been done many, many years ago, but that there was always a fear around what it would mean in terms of the backlash and popularity. So my answer is this: whether Nigeria is going to make it or not is largely dependent on the people that we elect and what we choose to do as a nation. As far as 30 years is a sufficient time to see meaningful progress. I can tell you that in Rwanda, what Rwanda has experienced over the past 8 years, and that's just 8 years, Nigeria could have experienced in a shorter period of time because we have more resources, we have more natural resources, we have more people. So over a time horizon like 30 years, I don't think it's the case that Nigeria is going to close its entire infrastructure gap in 30 years because the infrastructure gap is widening each year. But what I mean to say is that the time frame is sufficient provided that the political will and the seriousness is there to make meaningful progress. And that's just the reality. I tell people all the time, if you're not serious about what you're doing, if you're not a serious government, if you're not a serious nation, people have other things to do. People have other places they can invest their capital. Even African-focused development financial institutions, AFC has 43 member states. It's not just Nigeria. And you're doing projects across all of these places. So whether or not Nigeria is going to make it is going to be hinged on the level of seriousness that the government puts in, and I guess the quality of people that we elect. But the time frame is sufficient for us to make meaningful progress. There are countries that have done it. Cote d'Ivoire is doing fantastic right now. I mean, maybe fantastic is a bit, maybe because I'm excited about what they're doing, but Cote d'Ivoire is doing very good work right now because they are very serious. Anybody that is lending to Cote d'Ivoire right now, you know that this is a government that is committed to what is going on in the country. I'm currently doing 2 projects in Cote d'Ivoire. When I see the quality of the experts that I'm interacting with, I'm encouraged. I went to Sierra Leone in 2022 for a mining project, and I met with the Attorney General at the time. And my mind was blown. I was like, this is an extremely intelligent person, because you don't necessarily even, and this man took out his entire Saturday because we had an issue, so we couldn't meet on Friday. He took out his entire Saturday to meet with the sponsors, to meet with the banks, because the project was critical to the economy. So, again, seriousness is really what is going to require on everybody's part. I think, like we've said, the government has a road plan. The problems are not things that people don't understand. It's just, are we going to be serious about the solutions? But the time frame is sufficient.
Thanks for sharing that, Mayowa, and I hope that answers your question, Ajibola. So I think I'm going to bring up Tomiso now. Yeah, so you have the floor to ask a question.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Mayowa, for that session. It was very insightful. My question will be from a perspective of an NGO or like a non-profit business. One of the things you spoke about was bankability, the ability of anything that you are building or any infrastructure project you are involved in to be able to give back investors, whatever they have invested in the business, right? And profit is usually not the priority of NGOs or non-profit organizations, but some of them are usually involved in infrastructure projects. So my question is, how do you balance your objective to help people and get involved in infrastructure development?
I lost you right before. I lost you right before you started asking the concluding parts of the question. I got you up until where you said profit is not always the motive of an NGO, but they are typically involved in infrastructure projects. Please continue.
Yes. So my question is, how do you balance your objective to help people and get involved in infrastructure development, but also have sustainable funding? And I think it's not just related to Nigeria. It's not just a Nigerian problem, because I want to believe one of the major problems of the NHS in the UK is usually funding, and that's because their priority is not profits. And so they're always complaining, oh, the NHS is underfunded. So how do you balance it? It looks like you don't even have access to so many stakeholders, because most stakeholders want to invest and also want to get their money back. So it's like you're looking for someone that will just give you free money and say, oh, I believe in your cause. So how do you navigate striking that balance as an NGO involved in infrastructure development? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So the reality to your point is that globally, there is more capital available for profit-oriented ventures than there is for aids and grants. That's the reality, because most people that have assets under management, they also have responsibilities to their shareholders to render a return. If not, the institutions just will not be successful. Exactly. To use AFC as an example, AFC was started with $1 billion. That was it, $1 billion. If the organization had not invested aggressively in things that were going to generate a return, we wouldn't be talking about $13 billion invested today. You would be talking about an institution that no longer exists. So I think the start is, in as much as profit shouldn't be the entirety of your inspiration, it is important because it enables you to actually do more. But that being said, when we spoke about the sources of infrastructure financing, there are targeted sources of funding that are aimed towards aids and grants, and also concessional financing. And I'll give you an example. It's okay. I see someone spoke about CSR. That's also very important. But I'm even talking about at scale. CSR is typically on a small to a medium scale. I'll give an example. For NGOs that are looking to raise the kind of financing that they need, on the one hand, you need to position yourself as an NGO that has international credibility to a point where you can access the pools of funds available for the kinds of projects you do. And a lot of these resources are pretty publicly available. There's something called the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund is established to basically invest in climate resilient infrastructure, things that have like a sustainability impact. The Green Climate Fund gave AFC about $240 million of concessional financing to invest in climate-friendly projects. That is the kind of funding that is available on a concessional basis to institutions like NGOs. But the Green Climate Fund is not going to give that kind of funding to just any sort of institution. In fact, from an AFC perspective, this was the first endowment that the GCF had made in Africa, and that took almost 2 years to secure. So I guess to answer your question, one, profit is important because that's what enables these institutions to grow and even do more. But also there are pools of capital like the GCF, the World Bank, the AFDB. The AFDB has multiple facilities. During COVID-19, AFC and Afreximbank, I think, collaborated to put together COVID-related funding that was basically being on lent. I think it was about $200 million at the time to entrepreneurs across Africa. So these things are there, but at the same time, it's not on the same scale as with profit-oriented funding, but also from the perspective of the NGO, there's also something to be said for having the credibility and having the reach as well. Because if you go to CAC today and you check how many NGOs are in Nigeria, you might be a bit shocked. There are quite a few. And so a number of these probably just do not have the reach. And so if you look at it from the perspective of an international organization, they would much rather channel their funds through the established channels as opposed to taking risks with who they are channeling funds through as well. So hopefully that clarifies. CSR is also a useful point, by the way. I saw that in the chat. With AFC, with all the projects that we fund in countries, we make sure that CSR is a huge part of what happens. And I'll give an example. AFC is currently developing a gold mine in Sierra Leone. And part of the requirements that the sponsors were required to undertake, that project has built the first school in that village. It's called the Baomahun region in Sierra Leone. The first school in that community, the first hospital in that community, the first bank in that community. So, and this is something that we're doing everywhere that we do projects. We have a special economic zone in Ogun State, Nigeria today, operated by Arise IIP. And as part of the CSR, Arise is significantly funding a number of Ogun State government initiatives. So those are just some examples of CSR initiatives. But CSR will just never have the scale that, I guess, international aids and grants will have.
Thank you for sharing, Mayowa. So I'll be bringing up Daniel to ask his question.
Thank you very much. So I have two questions, one for Mr. Mike and one for Mayowa. So, okay, I'll go with Mr. Mike first. And this was the point that Mayowa raised, but I maybe feel because Mr. Mike has worked closely on the government front, he might be best placed to answer this. So it's in relation to, we've seen cases whereby an administration in Nigeria starts a project and then they transfer maybe 4 years or maybe 8 years, and then another administration comes and it's almost like, nah, I'm not interested, and then they kill it. So the question is, what are the practical steps we can take, first of all, as a nation and then as a people, to ensure that infrastructure projects are not administration-based and they are therefore long-term in the sense of it will withstand whoever is sitting on the chair? So that's the first question. The second question is to you, Mayowa, and I would like to get your perspective. So I'm an engineer by profession, and I've worked on large capital projects, but I honestly do not know how the money comes into play. I just get to the scene when there is money, and then we start working. So I would like to get your point of view of what happens, when you, let's say AFC, you sponsor a large capital project, and then the economic parameters that were used to build the case for making that project viable changes, like the example you gave, where the worst case scenario is now looking very nice today. So what happens from your point of view when it seems like this is money down the drain? Do you blacklist the country? Do you sue them? Do you take them to court? Like, in my head, it's like, yeah, the country is owing you money. So what happens?
Thank you, Daniel, for this question. So I think we'll just start with Mr. Mike and then move to Mr. Maiwa.
I think I got the last part of the question to me, which was around how do you ensure infrastructure projects remain a priority for government beyond an administration? I don't know if you answered. Okay, now so that question stems from the fact that we've been in a system where we have weak institutions. If you're in a system where there are strong institutions, whether a government comes in or a new government comes in, institutions the institutions drive the project, right? The leadership, the political leadership just sets out the policy direction, and the institutions align. So really, we shouldn't have those sort of issues if we have strong institutions, if we have respect for rule of law, we have functioning judiciary, and people understand there are implications to these things. Because what happens is really that when new administrations come in and you tell them, oh look, this project is already ongoing, they say no, we can cancel it. You tell them no, you advise and say no, we can't cancel it. They say what's the worst that will happen? You say, oh, they'll go to court. Yeah, let's go to court. That's why we're paying our lawyers. That's why we have the Ministry of Justice. Let them go to court, because they also know that will be a long and tedious process and nobody wants to do that. But the implication is that you've given these investors a haircut, or you've given the contractors a haircut, and they will never come back to that your jurisdiction again. Globally, every jurisdiction, even within Nigeria, states are competing for resources. Not to talk of at the national level, we are all competing with other countries for resources. So specifically to answer your question, I know I've just look, we need to strengthen our institutions, one. The other thing we need to do is to some extent, see how we can legislate on some infrastructure projects. If we can legislate on some infrastructure projects, but also, again, my argument against that approach really has always been, we've seen in this country where someone was removed, an emir was removed within 24 hours, right? The state legislature passed the bill, immediately that same day to be assented to. So even if you legislate, we just need leadership with strong political will, and we need strong institutions that can, because sometimes I just look at the American system and I see how institutions rise up against even presidents. So how can we have institutions that are bold enough and not in the pockets of our political leaders? So we need to strengthen our institutions. To do that, we need to look at the legal frameworks of these institutions. How do we strengthen these legal frameworks of these institutions? And then look at the selection process of our political leaders to be sure that they are the sort of right, the leadership. At the end of the day, everything we're discussing falls on leadership. If we have the right leadership, there are jurisdictions that do not have legal frameworks on some of these things, and because of the right leadership and the commitment, things are moving. But here we keep struggling, we keep working, even with the legislation, people are finding ways to cut and bend it. So leadership is important, but yeah, since we found ourselves here, let's see how we can strengthen our legal framework, regulatory frameworks, and how we can also enhance the quality of our institutions and the people driving those institutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Mike. So the next question, just to reiterate, is basically for Mr. Mayowa, your view on what happens if, for instance, the AFC sponsors a large project and because the budget has changed and then there's so much chaos, would you need to blacklist the country? Do you sue? Yeah, so that's the question from Daniel.
Okay, thank you. So I think firstly, the easiest part is no, you wouldn't blacklist the country. You can blacklist certain parties if maybe you finance like a private sector organization and they've misbehaved. Potentially, you could consider that. But someone defaulting on your loan is not really what you would blacklist them for. You would blacklist people for things like corruption issues or financing terrorism or environmental and social infractions. So I guess to really answer your question, what do you do when you finance a project? For instance, maybe your counterparty is the sovereign and things have gone belly up, you're not getting repaid. What are your realistic objectives? What are your realistic options? I think the first place to start is most financiers would not be financing projects or financing governments using local law as the governing law and dispute resolution mechanism. So if you're extending a loan to the Nigerian government, the last thing you're going to do is govern that agreement with Nigerian law and say that if you have a dispute, you go to court in Nigeria. I promise you, you're finished. Like, it will be so hilarious what happened to you. So what you find is that international finance is typically governed by English law, and you have dispute resolution in London, typically with the London Court of International Arbitration. And so if you're dealing with a sovereign, as with any project, you need to make sure that your security is as tight as it can be. Of course, that can be challenging with sovereigns, but it's also doable. I've worked on deals where we financed the Nigerian government specifically. Countries that are counterparties to financing agreements, firstly, you need a waiver of sovereign immunities in the document. So that's where the government is expressly stating that it would not claim any sovereign immunities in any disputes related to that deal or that project. Also, you need to make sure your governing law and dispute resolution is completely located outside of that country and outside of the sphere of influence of that country. So you typically use like an England, if it's French law, you might use Paris and ICC arbitration. Also, you need to be clear about what the scope is of the assets that you have access to. If the government defaults on your loan, governments do have assets that you can enforce on. Like I mentioned, people were enforcing on Nigeria's jets. Governments have residential properties. Governments have the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority, not to give anybody ideas, but the NSIA also has properties that you can enforce on. It's just that some of these things you tend to do privately because it has significant impact on the public perception of the country. But I think going to enforcement is really the nuclear option. No lender really wants to get there because enforcement is value destructive for everybody, even you as a lender. Imagine trying to sell like 4 different buildings, one in London, one in Zurich. You're trying to do like to make $400 million. It's going to take so much time and you destroy a lot of value. And that's why a lot of investors that want to invest in Africa, they like to do so through established development finance institutions. Because if you invest with the AFC, or if you invest through the AFDB or with Afrexim Bank, these institutions have immunities themselves. The AFC has something called preferred creditor status, same with Afrexim Bank or AFDB. And what this means is it's a bit more straightforward for institutions like this to get money out of governments than it would be for a Dangote or a BUA, for instance, because you are just a private entity. But these institutions actually have governments as their member states, and there are laws that have established this institution. There is a law in Nigeria called the Diplomatic Immunities Provisions Order that creates AFC's immunities in the country. So these institutions do have a preferred creditor status to a point where they can extract value to a certain extent easier or more easily than private parties would. But basically, it's not just one way you go about it. You have your security, you have your dispute resolution, you have partnering with financial institutions that have preferred creditor status, that have some immunities themselves. A lot of the time, commercial banks that want to lend money to African governments, they will come and meet an AFC and say, okay, wait, you lend the money, we will lend behind you. Because we know that if we have issues, it's called an AB loan structure. AFC will provide the A loan, they will provide the B loan, and it's really back to back. But what happens is if there's a default, they know that you as AFC, you have more clout or more pull with the government to get your money back, and then you can then help them get their money back. And so those are some of the ways in which you approach it. But at the end of the day, if nothing else works, then it's really just a loss. You have a project that has gone bad, and financial institutions do experience it from time to time.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So we're bringing up Paul for Olufemi to ask his question.
All right, thank you very much, Marwa. That was an awesome session, and I enjoyed your session. I just want to ask, I've been a little bit privileged to interact with some investors over here in Ireland, Europe. And then the challenge I usually have with them, sometimes when I discuss with them, I have some investors that have invested in Nigeria or in Africa startups as a whole, and they really lose a lot of money. And in the first 30 minutes, they go through webinars with me on how they invested in Africa and they have lost a lot of money. And I'll just be like, wow. So my own question to you is, how do you build investors' confidence? Like, how do you do that in AFC, for example? I know you say, for example, instead of financing a particular startup, they invest in you. So I just want to know your own perspective. How do you build investors' confidence over time to come back to Africa to come invest? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think that's a good question, and it's critical to even attracting investments for infrastructure. So maybe I'll speak about the tech issue first. The startup sector, the tech sector has suffered from like maybe regulation that hasn't quite been up to par with how fast the sector has been developing. I think even the Nigerian Startup Act was probably just passed maybe like 2 years ago. So firstly, a lot of investors lose money in venture capital as an industry. if you're doing venture capital, you're meant to expect that not everything you're going to invest in is going to make money. So that's a fact of life, investing in that space anywhere in the world. If you look at the statistics, even in the US, in San Francisco, the percentage of startups that actually survive after 2 years are probably like maybe less than 10%. So it's a pretty risky sector to invest in. That's why when it goes well, the returns are really high. But speaking about Africa particularly, I mean, again, it goes back to some of these things we've said. First of all, we've had a lot of founders that have misbehaved because people have seen the opportunity to raise money. You know, when you look at the news all the time, you see such and such company is now a unicorn. One of AFC's investee entities, Money Points, is now a unicorn as well. Sorry, I just had to mention. But you see a lot of companies that are raising all sorts of financing, doing so well. And so you feel like as an investor, you're missing out. So you quickly want to give your money to the next person that comes to you. For every tech project that we've probably invested in, I can tell you there are probably 10 that we've turned down. But the issue is a lot of people don't go to the extent of due diligence. And I think the person that spoke from the World Bank might have given you some insight into how extensive the due diligence is that needs to go into these things. I can tell you from personal experience outside of what I do for work, a lot of individuals that invest in startups just do not have either the capacity or the knowledge or the level of expertise required to do the level of due diligence that they should be doing. And so people tend to lose a lot of money. And that's why if you even try to invest with Piggyvest or all these apps, you see a lot of disclaimers where they tell you, for instance, don't invest more than 10% of your income, don't invest more than this, because it is a risky sector. But now to speak to the misbehavior that occurs and how do you improve image and build investor confidence, from the perspective of a country, like I gave in the presentation, one is about being serious about the things that you're doing. There are some things that are just ridiculous, I'm sorry to say. There are things that we see in the news all the time in this country. I'm like, this is a joke. Like, this has to be a joke, surely. Do you get what I mean? I'll give you an example. There was a former governor that the EFCC invited to the EFCC invited the person went, they did arrest him, then they went to arrest the person later in the evening, and they said they couldn't find him because another governor was protecting him. There are some things that are just comical. Like, if we're serious people, let's be serious. Two, as a country, you can have a long-term plan for how you want to invest and you can stick to it. So that gives people a sense of stability in investing long-term. Three, rule of law is very important, like everybody has said. Nobody is going to invest, even investors that are investing in tech startups. If they want to take those founders to court, for instance, they're going to have to come and sue them in Nigeria. But if they believe that court judgments can be bought or people can just, do funny things and the law is turned on its head, it discourages that confidence. So these are some of the things that you need to address if you want to build investor confidence. You need to address your rule of law. You need to have a plan. You need to ensure that the opportunities that you do get, you don't misbehave. I'll give you a very sad example. You look at the toll gate project in Lekki, where you had the NSAS process, right? Of course, that was a very terrible situation for everybody involved. But speaking specifically about the project, that's a project that is done. When they financed that project, they probably thought that tool was going to earn revenue over 20 years. That tool has not been operational for 3-4 years. So, of course, there were more important issues at stake that led to that situation. And I'm not taking anything away from what led to that. I'm just using the actual project as an example to say, these are the kinds of things that impact on perception. And unfortunately, if the government doesn't do as well as it should, you're going to have perception issues, and that's going to affect investor confidence generally. So, yeah.
All right, thank you for sharing that. Just a quick update that we cannot take more than 2 questions. So right now, I'll just be calling on Usola to also ask a question for the last person.
Thank you. I have 2 questions, one for Mr. Mike and one for Maiwa. My question for Mike is really around, we've been talking about implementation being one of the major problems to infrastructure development. My question is really around, what do you think is the right way of thinking about the policy or like navigating the political structure? Should we be thinking more in terms of short-term development plans, or should we be thinking about medium-term plans or long-term plans? Because we've said that with continuity, the problem is with continuity, different governments come and go and they don't continue with the projects and also like implement policies. So would you say we should just focus on short-term policies that can be implemented within the government's electoral mandate and window? And then my question to Maiwa is really around, what do you think is really the role of domestic institutions as well, like domestic banks? Do you think they have the capacity also to like deliver on infrastructure financing? So yeah, thank you.
Okay, so Mr. Mike, you have the floor.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that question. So infrastructure projects by their very nature are typically long-term projects. However, given the sort of, I'm not in this context, I'm talking about traditional procurement process for infrastructure projects. So you have like an annual budgeting process for this sort of projects. So I think we need to think in that spectrum, short, medium, and long term. We can't, they are all quite important. There are projects that are quick win projects that you need to quickly do to, to show impact, to build public support, to build public support and also public trust. Because you need to also give it to we need to also, and here it's not really cutting the political leaders on slack, but look, they have 4 years and you have an infrastructure project that will take, maybe 8, 10, 15 years, right? How within that 4 years can they demonstrate that, they've delivered something tangible to the people? And that is in a context where I say, look, you need to be able to dimension these projects across these different spectrum. You need to look at the short term, the medium term, and the long term. You need to think across this full spectrum. And we need to also, I think we place the burden solely on leadership or on the political leaders too much. Whereas we also have a role to play as citizens and individuals. And I tell you this because when it's time for elections, if a political leader has set out the framework for delivering projects, for delivering a series of projects over 10 years, maybe he has even started a series of these projects, nobody's going to count it. You would have been hearing phrases in this country of MOU governor, MOU president, the process of closing transactions, and Mayowa will attest to that. There are transactions that could take you 4 years to close. It takes you a number of years to prepare and plan this project properly. You hit commercial close, you start trying to meet condition precedent to move towards financial close. So it's a process. But we as citizens, are we patient enough with that process? The day you sign an agreement in government with a private investor, the next day the citizens want to see the project just appear. And you hear all manner of narratives around how failed it's when even the project has not even moved, in fact, to financial close. So there's a lot of sensitization and citizen expectation management that also needs to happen so that we understand the process. That look, the fact that a political leader does not commission a project doesn't mean that work there's no ongoing work around that particular project. We also need to understand and appreciate that no political leader is doing us a favor by constructing a road, by providing pipe. It's not a favor. It's not a favor they are doing. It is part of the responsibilities and what they've been elected to do. So we need to have this appreciation and think in that spectrum. What are the quick wins that we can do as a government when they come in? What are the medium-term projects we can do? What are the long-term projects? But we also, as a matter of policy, we also need to be able to prioritize ongoing projects. Because it's not really, because this idea of building a new project because you want your name to be attached to it shouldn't be there. It's a project, it's for the benefit of citizens. So once we have that behavioral change, I think it will go a long way. But again, we need to also think through that spectrum. Because where we are, any government we need to quickly build trust. So we need to think through the short, the medium, and the long term. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mike. So the next question from Sola is basically, what is the role of domestic institutions, for instance, banks, and your view, do you think that they have the capacity to deliver on institutional financing? So this is for Mr. Maiwa.
Yeah, it's a good question because we do have large banks in Nigeria. So I think I'll firstly start by saying some banks do participate on infrastructure projects. There is a project that I know that Access Bank funded quite recently, actually, about $60 million for the expansion of something that was pretty important. So firstly, they do participate, but I think in terms of their capacity, I think the capacity of commercial banks to really finance considerable infrastructure projects is quite limited. It's limited from the perspective of balance sheet because these banks do not necessarily have the balance sheet that is required. When I talk about balance sheet, I mean the financial capacity in terms of their free funds that they can channel towards an infrastructure project and fund it by themselves. There is no Nigerian bank that could have funded Dangote's refinery. There is no Nigerian bank that could probably have funded most of the refineries that you have in Africa. So there's a balance sheet limit for sure. There's also an incentive limit. Commercial banks are really set up to make profits. And profit, from the perspective of a commercial bank, you're being evaluated on that every year. And it relates to the point Mike just made. How do you think long term when you need to report to your shareholders every December and say this is how much we've made? Do you get what I'm saying? So from the perspective of a commercial bank, that person is probably thinking, how do I meet my targets for this year? He's not really thinking, okay, and I'm talking about the bank MD. The bank MD is not really thinking, oh, let me invest in this infrastructure project that I'll start getting repaid 6 years from now. 6 years from now, he might not be MD anymore. So a lot of the time, they are limited by their incentives. Their incentives are to make profit, maximize profit as quickly as possible. And infrastructure, like I said, is a long-term play. A lot of the time, as an institution like AFC, you're currently making money from deals you did 6 years ago. The money you're making this year is probably something you did 10 years ago or 7 years ago. So it's very long-term. And commercial banks are just not set up. Their business model is not really set up to operate that way. I think outside of balance sheet and the incentives, there are also areas in which they can participate, even if they don't fund the entirety of the project. And we do collaborate with commercial banks in all the countries we work in all the time. So for instance, if you're funding a project like the Dangote refinery, commercial banks are involved in that project. I think all the major banks are actually involved in that project. Even if you're not financing the development of the project, you can finance working capital. Working capital is the capital that the project requires, maybe to fund the commodities or the crude oil that it buys or things of that nature. You can fund working capital. You can play a role as the account bank. That is the bank that manages the accounts of the entity. So there are other opportunities where commercial banks have played significant roles. But in terms of whether I think they have what it takes to fund these projects in a significant way, I think there are very serious limitations there, but also because that's just not what they are set up to do. Commercial banks are primarily set up to invest in what you would call, they basically take money from individuals that have a surplus to fund individuals and entrepreneurs that have a deficit, such that they can earn returns in the short to medium term.
Okay, thanks so much for sharing that. So our last question for today is from Muturayo. So you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Maya. I love how pragmatic you were about your presentation. I kept swinging my fingers. So my question is around the cost benefits area. I know you mentioned that when investors are investing their money, they want to see what's in it for them, like the revenue. They have to make the money back and also like the revenue. But in the case of education, for example, where you don't get the return on your investment immediately. And I tend to see that when we talk about investment and infrastructure in Nigeria or Africa generally, we try to like bring education, put education at the back. And I want to an example. So I went to a public school, and during my time in that public school, it's Lagos State Model College, there was a partnership between World Bank and with the Lagos State government, and it really transformed like the whole landscape of the school. Like we had roofs. Like I went to a school where we literally didn't have roofs, and there were no even chairs, there were no boards. And then that partnership really like transformed the education experience. And I mean, I'm doing well for myself. So I wanted to ask, like, what would you say its impact in terms of like investments in education, and why is it that several government administration do not prioritize like education funding or infrastructure funding in education?
So I think it's a very important question. I thank you very much. I think sometimes when people ask what is the biggest problem that Nigeria has today, it's very hard to put it down to one thing, but sometimes I playfully tell people that the literacy level is probably the biggest issue. And if you can educate more people, it kind of has a positive spillover effect into everything else. Now, what is the challenge with financing education infrastructure, and why does it seem like it doesn't typically come to the forefront? The reality is this: education comes under something you call social infrastructure. Social infrastructure would include things like schools, it would include things like hospitals, it would include things like public parks or libraries. You can't really run away from the fact that social infrastructure is primarily the responsibility of the government. The government should be funding social infrastructure primarily from its budgetary allocations, and historically in Nigeria, this has not been the case. We've had comparisons whereby every time there's a new national budget, people put side by side, they say this is how much the government is spending on the National Assembly, and this is how much is spending on education. This is how much is spending on healthcare. The Nigerian government has consistently underinvested in education. It has consistently underinvested in healthcare and things of that nature because it prioritizes things like what they call defense spending, which if you probe the corruption in that, you will probably pass away, like you will faint. They prioritize things like, salaries of lawmakers. They prioritize things that sometimes you question, and this goes back to fiscal responsibility. So social infrastructure primarily is not going to be the focus of any bank. A bank is not going to generate an income immediately from financing a school. That is the responsibility of the government. That's not to say that there are not opportunities for private institutions to collaborate on those things, but it just is not their primary responsibility. If you go to a Goldman Sachs or a JP Morgan and you tell them to finance your refinery, they'll be happy to look at that project because that's something that's going to generate significant economic impact for them. But if you tell them you want to build schools in Africa, who's going to repay that? The money that they are lending you, they didn't get it. It's not free. They didn't print it. They also have, I talk about institutions like AFC and how much AFC is investing. That comment is very funny. Talk about institutions like AFC and how much AFC is investing. AFC borrows money. I'm currently working on a deal. AFC is trying to borrow $300 million from certain banks in the Islamic Gulf region. This is the same money that we're going to on-lend in Africa, but we need to pay that money back. So AFC is not going to borrow $300 million and come and build schools in Lagos State. Nobody is going to pay. Who is going to pay that back? If the Lagos State government says, give us money, we'll build the schools, and Lagos State government will pay you back, that's a different conversation. But as far as social infrastructure is concerned, social infrastructure does not generate the kind of revenue that is going to offset what a financial institution requires from the places it has also raised its money. Every institution has its own cost of funds. So that unfortunately is the reality of the situation. It's more of the government's responsibility. The government can be much more fiscally responsible and over time should have been much more fiscally responsible. Education should not be a function of you just building the first secondary school in a state today. This is 2024. Nigeria has had independence since 1960. You should largely have invested in infrastructure in what they call the boom years. If you know how much Nigeria was making from crude oil exports in the first 30 years post-independence, that's when a lot of these foundational expenses should have been incurred. But now, unfortunately, this is probably the poorest Nigeria has been. And now we're trying to build the first school in this village, the first school in that village. It really just doesn't make sense that this is only just happening, if you get what I mean. And that is largely attributable to the fiscal irresponsibility as well as just corruption and mismanagement.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for asking amazing questions and to our speakers for the amazing answers as well. If you feel that you still have more questions, you can slide into their DM on social media. Yeah, just slide into their DMs and ask your questions. So right now, I'll be handing over to our host for today, our delightful host. So, Sola, you have the floor right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Boluwatife. And thank you so much to everyone, our facilitators, Mike and Mayowa. For those who were here yesterday, you would agree that the conversation has been building progressively. At the start yesterday, one of the things we talked about at the beginning was how to assess good and quality infrastructure. And Sandra also took us into the due diligence process by the World Bank and the IFC aspect of the World Bank. So we've had lots of insightful conversations. And thank you so much to Mike for talking through the PPPs and the political dimension of building infrastructure, and Maya also for engaging and telling us about the financial aspect of infrastructure. The work we do at InfraSpotlight is to have this kind of conversations, to educate people so people can also take actions. Something that Mike said is that we can't leave it to the government alone. So there's something that we are doing at InfraSpotlight where we are building the capacity of citizens like myself and yourself to be able to contribute to the process. And so we have workshops like this to discuss and find solutions to some of these problems. We have a blog where we publish knowledge articles. We ask that you please stop by and check our blog and read up on the things that we're doing, our research publications. My colleague Towoji is going to drop the feedback survey for this workshop. Please, we ask that you give us a feedback. We want to improve for future workshops. So please share your feedback and how we can basically improve for the coming sessions, especially in 2025. Now to the big announcement. Something that we're also doing at InfraSpotlight is to ensure that there is a better connection between citizens and government, so citizens understand government processes and how it relates to infrastructure development. We have a project we started this year in May. It's an infrastructure policy project, which we have named Seranova. So Seranova is an online policy dashboard on infrastructure policies in Nigeria and across Africa. We've basically researched every infrastructure policy and all policies and development plans that relate to infrastructure development. We have analyzed and we have basically built this amazing online dashboard where you can access this information. So you can support us on this project. We sometimes require assistance with research, data analysis. And so if you'd like to be part of what we are building, you can please send us an email at hello@infraspotlight.com to contribute to this project. We are going to be launching this dashboard in January. And we hope that once this dashboard is live, you'll be able to see the current progress of infrastructure policies, which has been implemented, the reforms that governments have committed to under those policies. Another thing that we are also doing is we are tracking and monitoring infrastructure projects that has been signed off so we can inform citizens like yourself to know what's the status. So if the government started this project in 1980, what's the process? Why has it been delayed? So we're trying to really leverage technology to inform as many people. And as we continue to develop our capacity, we are also looking to translate this information in indigenous language so it's accessible to as many people as possible. I cannot close this session without saying thank you to NG Youth SDGs. Thank you so much for helping and supporting us on this for this workshop. Thank you so much for the remarkable work you do. If you do not know about NG Youth SDGs yet, please go and check out their social media page. And they are also like building capacities of young Nigerians to be able to accelerate the SDGs in Nigeria. And with that, thank you so much to everyone. We please ask that you fill our feedback survey, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.